Hey everyone, welcome back. And if you're new, welcome. My name is Adelina and I do videos about living in my tiny house. Today, I'm going to do a video about heating options for a tiny house. How to choose them, some of the options that are out there, what I have and why I chose what I have. So if that's something that you're interested in, stay tuned. The first thing you need to think about when you're choosing the type of heating source for your tiny house is how much BTUs you need for the system that you put in. Don't ask me what BTUs stand for. I don't know. I just know that that's what you need. And you can go online and choose a BTU calculator. They're everywhere. I'll link one down below that I used when I was doing the research for this. When you use that calculator, it will tell you whether or not the source that you want to use is going to be sufficient for the size of your tiny house, or if you might need a supplementary source. So that's the first thing that you're going to need to take into consideration when you're deciding on the heating source for your tiny house. You're going to also want to consider the lifestyle that you want to lead in your tiny house. Do you want to be on grid or off grid? Are you going to be moving your tiny house regularly, or are you going to be stationary or even on a foundation? Will you be installing it yourself? So, ooh. Okay, this big little girl just about fell off the stool. I know I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny, except it is funny. What was I saying? So you need to think about whether you'll be installing it yourself, or you're going to have a professional install it, what your budget is for not only the system that you buy or put in, but also to maintain it, how much effort you want to put in to maintain it. Those are all things to consider when you're deciding on your tiny house heat source type. Next, I'm just going to go over the most common types of heat sources for a tiny house. The first source we're going to talk about is a wood stove or fireplace. Usually what I see in tiny houses are very, very small wood stoves that are like, I think there's one that's called the Hobbit, things like that, really small. They are, I think, fairly easy to install yourself if you know what you're doing. The nice thing about wood heat is that it's a dry heat, so it can help you sort of manage the amount of humidity in your house. They can be cheap to run if you have a wood source handy. Say you have a piece of land with a lot of trees on it, and you're able to use that for your wood source. They can be really cost effective that way. They are a dry source of heat. There's no thermostat, so you can't control the temperature in your house very easily. It's very easy to overheat a very, very small space, and a wood stove, it's not like you can just turn it down. So that's something to really keep in mind. Because the size of unit that you're going to put into your house is going to be small, you're going to need very small pieces of wood to go in it, which means that they won't burn as long as a big piece of wood. So keep in mind that when you go to bed at night in winter, and you're using wood heat as your only source of heat, that in the middle of the night you're going to have to get up to put more wood into it, or if you don't do that, when you get up in the morning, it's going to be very cold in there. That could be a problem if it gets really cold, like it does sometimes here in the winter in Alberta, Canada, and there's the possibility of pipes freezing overnight. If you don't have a wood source, it can be expensive to buy wood. I know that there are some very minimal clearance wood stoves that you can buy, but they're very expensive. Most wood stoves that you buy need a fair amount of clearance behind them to the wall just to be fire safe. Also, they need clearance in front, and they need definitely a fireproof flooring in front of them and underneath them. It's going to take up a fair amount of room in your tiny house, even if it's a small wood stove, because of the clearance and the fact that you need that hearth. A wood stove is also, I think, the most hands-on heating source that you could choose, because you have to cut or buy your wood, you're constantly having to feed the fire, you're getting up in the middle of the night to stoke the fire and add more wood, or you're certainly, having to build a fire first thing in the morning. If you're not up for that, then it's not going to be for you. Also, if it's not installed properly, there's a possibility that it's not safe. And really, one of the big considerations when using wood as your only heat source in your tiny house is the fact that if you're not home for long periods of time, then there's no heat in your house. So even if you're away all day in the middle of a cold winter for work, there's no heat in the house, which could potentially cause a problem for your pipes. It'll certainly be a problem if you have pets in the house and they need to stay warm. And then if you travel at all, you're going to have to make arrangements for somebody to be there to make sure that the house is warm in the winter. There's a lot of hands-on attention that needs to be paid to that, especially in the cold times. There's no thermostat, so you can't control the heat. It's either hot or cold. That's something that I wouldn't like. I also think that it's not a really convenient heat source as your only heat source if you travel a lot in your tiny house, because you're going to have to either carry wood with you or make sure that you can buy wood wherever you do park. The next heating source that I want to talk about is propane. Propane heater can be a really good option for a tiny house. It allows you to be off-grid. It allows you to move your tiny house and always have your heat source with you. Definitely has a thermostat that you can manage. It can be, fairly hands-off, especially if you buy big bottles of propane if you're parked somewhere, for a long period of time, or have them delivered and switched out. You see a lot of propane heaters, these wall-mounted ones that were made, actually designed for boats, and they have a little flame that you can see. And they're really kind of pretty on the wall. They don't take up a lot of space because they're wall mounted. One of the things to consider about those is that they can get very hot. And I've read a couple of stories of people who've put them in very small tiny houses and find that they just pump out too much heat for a space that size. Also, you can get propane heaters that you would use outside or in a garage or something like that. That means that your propane bottle is most likely inside the shell of your home, and that can be a safety risk. You really want to use, if you're going to use a propane heater as your main heat source, you really want to make sure that it's direct vented outside. And if you use something like I have an RV furnace, they are direct vented outside. So my propane bottles would be outside under the gooseneck, actually, if I were on propane right now, which I'm not, but I'll talk about. So if you're going to use that sort of heat, you really can't use it at night because you have to worry about that. You have to crack a window and have some flow coming in. And they do pump a lot of moisture into the air because propane does release moisture when it burns. So if you don't have a direct vent propane heater, then you really have that consideration as well. I wouldn't think that a freestanding propane heater would be a good choice for your main heat source. Maybe a secondary heat source, an emergency heat source, but something that I would really hesitate just for safety purposes, especially, to have as my main heat source. I said that I have a forced air furnace, and I had intended on it being hooked up to propane. The nice thing about these furnaces is that they can run on propane or natural gas. And when I moved into my parking spot here, which is inside a municipality, a city, in a mobile home park, they wouldn't allow propane appliances inside the unit. I'm hooked up to natural gas, the city utilities. But the nice thing about these furnaces, the RV furnaces, is that they can work on propane or natural gas. It was just a matter of changing the fitting on the end of the hose. If you're going to use natural gas as your heating option, you're going to basically have to be on grid. And that limits where you're going to park and obviously your mobility. On the other hand, it's extremely convenient because you don't have to worry about switching out tanks. It's very safe. It tends to be very economical, at least where I am. Natural gas is really actually very inexpensive, so it's an inexpensive way to heat my house. Because it's a forced air furnace, like I said, it's a nice dry heat. I don't have to worry about any moisture being pumped into the air. It works well for me, but when I move my tiny house and I go more off-grid and switch to propane, my furnace will still work just as well. And because it's a direct vent RV forced air furnace, I don't have to worry about any safety as far as gas or any moisture in the air from the heater. You can install it yourself if you know what you're doing, and I wouldn't I wouldn't try and install one myself because of the ducting or anything like that. And I'll insert a couple of pictures of my tiny house being built and the ductwork that was being run for my forced air furnace. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 heat vents in my tiny house. It's a very easy to sort of manage heat source. I love that there's a thermostat that I can control the heat. I can set it nice and low at night or when I'm away, but I know that I don't have to worry about my house freezing, any pipes freezing. So that was my choice for furnaces. The next most common choice for heating your tiny house is electric heat. You can have built-in radiators or these wall-mounted units that are ceramic, or you can buy these freestanding little space heaters with a fan in them. The pluses are they're inexpensive to buy, they're certainly inexpensive to install, you can do it yourself. They have thermostats, so you have that convenience as well. And they're safe, because even the freestanding ones, they have the tip off features, so if it gets knocked over, it shuts itself off. So those are pluses. To use electric heat for your only heat source in your tiny house could be a very expensive option. I know certainly here where I am in Canada, electric heat is going to be your most expensive option. They're not very energy efficient, especially the little blower ones. They're not good if you plan on being off-grid, because even if you have a solar system with your tiny house to be off-grid, they take up a lot of power to run, and you're going to have a hard time building a solar system that is going to be robust enough to handle a full winter of heating your house, especially in the winter with it being more snow and less sunlight and harder to get solar power. So it wouldn't be a choice that I would make. It would be a great secondary choice, and I actually have a electric fireplace that's also got a little heater, and it's my secondary heat source, which came in handy recently, and I'll talk about that in another video. It wouldn't be the one that I would choose as my main heat source. I think if you're traveling a lot in your tiny house, it might not be the best option, unless when you park, you always have hookups. Say you're parking in RV parks and you always have electrical hookups, but you won't be able to use it easily off-grid. While it's inexpensive to install, easy to install and easy to manage, it can be very, very expensive to maintain, and that's something that you really want to think about. Okay, there's one more that I want to talk about that is quite common, and that is radiant in-floor heating. Now, that was an option that actually I wanted initially, and I changed my mind about that, and I'll explain why. To first explain that what it is, it's basically a set of coils or ducts that are run in the floor under your main flooring. It can be run either over top of your subfloor or set inside the joists under the subfloor. There are 3 main types of radiant in-floor heating: air, electric, and or water-based. Air is not as common. The most common ones are the electric and the water-based. The pros are that it's a very efficient source of heat, energy efficient. It doesn't take up room in your house. It's a very comfortable heat. There's certainly anybody who's crawled out of bed on a cold day and stepped onto a heated floor, or out of a shower and stepped onto a heated floor, certainly knows how nice that is on your toes when you do that. In-floor radiant heating also gives you the option for a thermostat. It's very hands-off. You're not chopping wood and feeding a fire or anything like that, and it's safe. Keep in mind that if you're going to have in-floor radiant heating, you're going to need a fair amount of electricity. So I think being off-grid might be a challenge. The electric ones can be very easy to install yourself because you can even buy mats the size of whatever room, standard sized rooms, and you just lay the mat underneath your flooring. Basically plug it in, so it's very easy to install that way. I think if you're going to get a liquid one, a water-based one, probably most people are not going to be comfortable installing that themselves, but you might be. But the system is a lot more complicated. It can be more expensive to buy and install, especially if you're having somebody install it for you. And I don't think it's something that is a good heat source if you're traveling a lot and going to be off-grid. When I was building my tiny house, I thought that that would be an awesome heat source for the tiny house. I mean, how comfortable is it, like I said, to step onto a nice warm floor? And I wasn't sure how cold the floor would be in a tiny house on wheels. Turns out it's nice and toasty because it's so well insulated. My floor is spray foam insulation with a really nice high R value. But I did want it in my tiny house. Now, in discussions with my builder, one of the things that she pointed out, and that I had not considered at all, is the fact that if something goes wrong with your Infloor, your radiant Infloor heating system, you have to tear up your floor to get at it. And that's going to be a hassle. If your baseboard electric heater goes out, you can probably switch that out yourself. Even if the RV furnace, something happens to it, there's a panel on the outside of the house, and it's very easy to get at. Also, there's access from inside the house, so it's easy to get at and easy to fix, maintain, even switch out. But if you put radiant flooring in your tiny house and something goes wrong with it, it's going to be expensive and messy to fix. And I also don't know, especially with the liquid ones, maybe not so much with the electric matte style, but with the liquid ones, I'm not convinced that they would do well in a house that got moved around a fair amount. So I decided against it. If you are stationary and you know you're not going to move, say even you're building your tiny house on a foundation and you have a lot of electric capacity, it can be an awesome heat source for you. It takes a while to heat up, and it certainly takes a while to cool down. So if your house is a little too hot, it's going to take a while for things to cool off. If you wake up on a chilly morning and you want to heat your house up quickly, that's not going to do it. It'll do it faster in a small house than it does in a great big house, but it's still not going to be as fast as a forced air furnace or an electric heater or a fireplace or wood stove. Just to recap, I think the things that you really need to have in mind when you're deciding on your heat source for your tiny house are as follows. You really want to think about your lifestyle. Do you want to be off-grid or on-grid? Do you want to travel with your tiny house fairly regularly? Because those are the two main things that you have to keep in mind when you're deciding on your tiny heat source. Also, you really want to think about your climate. If you live in California or Arizona, you probably can avoid this video altogether because you might just need an electric space heater, or something very, very minimal. A little wood stove that you turn on a couple times a year might be perfect for you. I don't live in that climate. I live in a northern climate where we get long, cold winters. My heat source decision was really important, and one that I really thought about a lot. If I don't heat my house properly in the winter, my pipes will freeze and I will have a great big mess. Also, my cat will freeze and she won't be very happy, though she might be a catsicle, which would mean she's less hassle. If you live in a climate that's really humid, choosing a heat source that doesn't deposit a lot of moisture in your air, or on the flip side actually helps dry out the air inside your house, could be really important. Like I said, a wood stove definitely is a dry heat source. So is a natural gas or direct vented propane furnace, a forced air furnace, or electric. You also want to think about how much effort you want to put in day to day for your heat source. If you have a propane heater, then you're going to have to switch out the bottles. Now, you could buy great big bottles, or you could have them delivered and switched out for you, but that will cost money. You'll have to manage how much propane you have in your tanks to make sure you don't run out, especially in the winter. If you have something like a wood stove, obviously there's going to be a lot of everyday attention that needs to be paid to that when you're in your cold season. You're going to have to chop wood, you're going to have to, or have it delivered, you're going to have to feed your fire, you're going to have to clean that stove, make sure that the flue is cleaned and safe. Even at night, if it's your only heat source, you're going to have to get up and feed that wood stove because they're small and they take small pieces of wood and they don't burn for that long. With a wood stove in a very cold climate, you're going to be thinking about your heat a lot, and that might not be a problem, or it might be an issue. It's just really something important to think about. You also have to think about the cost. The cost to install, whether or not you're going to do it yourself or if you're going to pay to have a professional install it. The cost factor is important. The cost to install, to buy, the cost to install, and the ongoing cost to pay for the heat is just something that you want to factor in when you're making that decision. So what do I have? I have a Dometic RV forced air furnace. Now it runs on either propane or natural gas. It is compact. It does take up some space, but it's tucked away, and I'll show you where it's tucked away. So it's compact. I really like that there's a thermostat that I can control the heat, and I love that it's a nice dry heat, so it helps me manage the moisture level in the tiny house. And when I move from the city and I'm more off-grid, I will get the tall propane tanks, and I will have to manage that. It gave me the option to be off-grid or on-grid, which was important to me. My furnace is direct vented outside, so it's safe, and I have a propane detector anyways inside the house. My furnace does an incredibly efficient job of heating my tiny house. It's not my only source. Like I said, I have the electric heater on my fireplace, and that came in handy when I had a problem with my thermostat a couple weeks ago, which I'll talk about in my next video, in which I'm going to be just going over some of the maintenance things in the tiny house now that I've been here over a year. I talked at the beginning of the video about how important it was to do a BTU calculator for your tiny house, and they're everywhere. I will link one down in the show notes. The calculation for the BTUs necessary for my tiny house is 35,900-ish. My furnace is a 40,000 BTU furnace, so I'm well within the ability for my furnace to manage the tiny house. The next size smaller was 35,000. That was not going to be big enough. So I'm quite confident that no matter what, no matter how cold it gets, and it has gotten very cold here, that my furnace can keep up with what I need to keep it nice and toasty inside. Just keep in mind that it's important to know that, especially in a really cold climate, because the last thing you want is to have your heat source not keep up with the cold outside. Also, I really think it's important to have more than one heat source. So if you are using a wood stove as your primary heat source, have a secondary heat source. Have a electric space heater, have a propane heater, something that you can crack a window if you have to use it while you're getting your main heat source sorted out, say something goes wrong or it needs to be fixed. I think that's really important to always have a backup if you're in a cold climate. It's not a sexy part of building your tiny house, like the design and the cupboards and counters and all of that. However, it's probably one of the most important sources if you're in a cold climate. If you're in a warm climate, obviously a cooling sources are going to be your priority. I can't speak to that because I don't have an air conditioner in the tiny house. I've never needed one. This video is about heat sources. Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. I noticed that over 90% of viewers that watch my videos are not subscribers. It would really help me out and help the channel out if you would consider subscribing. I'd love to have you part of the family. It would just be awesome. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Too high? Soph? Is that too high? Yeah?